Well, let's jump in. We are in a teaching series that we've entitled, That's a Good Question. We're looking at some of the 173 questions that Jesus asked in the four Gospels. As I've been saying, Jesus asked questions we may not be self-aware enough to ask ourselves, or perhaps we just might be too afraid to ask ourselves. So these are wonderful questions. I'm going to continue on in this teaching series through May, which means 4 more weeks. We've already done 4 weeks. Jesus is still asking the very same questions of us today. And so let's do a quick little review. First question, we kicked off the series with a question, but who do you say I am? Such a pointed and personal question. And it's asked because it's far too easy, as I've said, to hide in the ideas of the community or hide in the crowd that is around us. It's easy because, well, that's the comfortable thing to do. It doesn't offend anyone. It doesn't put us in a place where we stand out. And in a culture like ours today, built on the foundation of tolerance and pluralism and relativism, it's easy to slide into the crowd. But who do you say I am? The question is on the final. It is. Who do you say I am? And the answer is, you are the way, the truth, and the life. You are the way. Not one way among many ways. You're the way. You're the truth. Not the, well, it's my truth, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true for you. No, he is the truth, and he is the only source of life. Question number 1. Question number 2 was, do you want to get well? And spiritually speaking, before we can answer that question in the affirmative, well, we have to admit we're sick, and we have to admit the nature of our illness. We have a sin issue. Question number 3, and I love this question, do you see this woman? The question was directed to Simon the Pharisee, who was blinded by his own self-righteousness and his own judgmentalism. And I said when we view life through that lens of legalism, everything gets distorted. Simon's religion made him inhospitable to Jesus. It made him judgmental and unloving to this poor, hurting woman. And it made his own sin invisible to himself. Religiosity creates the biggest blind spots. What do you see? Such an important question. Question number 4, do you love me? And this was such a tender question. It was designed to restore Peter after his failure, which we can all relate to. And the question reminds us, we don't perform our way back into God's favor. He will not allow us to boast in our goodness or in our performance. We can only boast in his grace. And so the application was, don't wallow in your regret and your shame and your past failure. Jesus is saying, do you love me? Then get back in the game. Get back in the game. Love for me is all that's required. So on to question 5. There was a study that was done, well, it was a number of years ago, obviously, because it involved payphones. Remember dropping quarters into a payphone? I vividly remember that, calling home to Mom from Louisville, Kentucky. But sometimes the phone would dispense change at the end of the call. And so people kind of got in the habit of checking out the change slot to see if someone had forgotten their change. So in this study, they filled the change slot with $1.35 in change. And when a person went to make a call, they found money. Yes, $1.35 went into their pocket. And immediately after exiting the phone booth, however, someone would approach that person and they would ask them, did you happen to find money in the change slot? 97% said, nope. Didn't find any. And then they altered the study. Same exact setup, same amount of money, people going in to make calls, checking, pocketing the change, and they exited they exited the booth, as they did, a person would come up, ask them the very same question. But this time, the questioner would touch the person on the shoulder or touch the person on the arm and say, did you happen to find any change in the return slot? Same question. But the results were absolutely flipped upside down. 95% of the people said, yeah, I did. And some of them even offered the money to the person that asked them. Sort of an interesting study. And more serious studies have been done about touch. Touch in a child's early development paves the way for their ability to express love and intimacy in later life. Studies show touch early on in life is not only necessary for the child's emotional development, but it plays a significant part, apparently, in their physiological development, because studies show that infants who were afforded all the necessities of life, except they really weren't touched. It was called failure to thrive syndrome, I believe, and their mortality rate was much higher. There's something about touch. Touch plays a huge role in life. Fascinating psychological topic. I could just keep talking about that. But I get there today because touch plays a big role in our passage. We'll come back to that. Mark chapter 5, I'm going to begin at verse 21. And as I have in the past weeks, to set the scene, I'm just going to work through the passage sort of verse by verse and give you enough color and enough background to set the stage as we move toward the good question. So, Mark chapter 5. Then Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake. A large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come, put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. Jesus is at the height of his ministry success at this moment. People are following him in droves. Just imagine that. Crowds are huge. And at this point, the synagogue leader, a prominent man, a respected man, comes and literally throws himself at the feet of Jesus and says that his daughter is near death. That's the context. Jesus is now en route to see and heal this religious leader's daughter. At that moment that we're introduced to this pathetic figure, a woman who now becomes the main character in our passage, verse 25. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. She lived with a bleeding uterus for 12 humiliating years. She had been labeled unclean by the rabbis and subject to all the Levitical prohibitions around it. See, if you were an Orthodox follower of Judaism, you could not come into contact with blood. If you were bleeding like this woman, you were required to stay away. The same way that a leper was required to call out, "Unclean, unclean." This was more than social distancing. Okay? People avoided you. You were shunned. The only people who would associate with lepers were other lepers. And this woman is in a very similar plight. She was forbidden to touch others, and it was forbidden to touch her. We've all had a bad day, a bad week, a bad season, but very few can appreciate the plight of this woman. Just imagine, it may have been years since she has felt the touch of another human being. ostracized by the synagogue, orphaned by society, and forgotten by God, or so she thinks. Because she has prayed, she has pleaded, but for 12 agonizing years, God has been silent. Her eyes are downcast as people pass by. She's self-conscious, ashamed, and afraid. She fears the condescension in people's eyes. She fears the indifference in their shoulder as it is turned coldly against her. But most of all, she fears the gavel that you bring down her life. She fears the sort of rapt judgment that her illness is somehow the direct result of some personal sin. It was a sort of superstitious belief at that time, and quite frankly, it still is. People think that somehow that this tragedy in my life is somehow connected to my sin. And with a uterine hemorrhage, anyone could guess what kind of sin this woman had committed. Sexual, no doubt, are the whispered, cruel innuendos. Some sexual perversion are the gossiped indictments. And so, besides the shame of the constant bleeding, she bears the burden of its stigma. She carries that weight with her everywhere she goes. She's gone to doctor after doctor, and their folk remedies have only relieved her of her money. She is now destitute. And that steady loss of blood over the years is taking its toll. She's anemic, she's pale, she is tired. So very, very tired. Tired of the shame, tired of the stigma. Childhood hopes and dreams have been shattered. Chronic suffering has a way of doing that. Sort of get the pathos of the scene. But stories of another physician reach down and begin to pick up those pieces of her dreams. A physician who charges no fees. A physician committed to making a sick world well again. And she has heard about this physician, this Jesus who comes not to the healthy, but to the sick. Who comes not to the strong, but to the downtrodden. And she has heard of Jesus' success among the incurables, the curing of an uncontrollable demoniac, the raising of a dead widow's son, the healing of a leper. A leper, she thinks, another untouchable like me. The divine physician simply touched this disease-eaten man, and he was clean, whole. Certainly, she thinks, if I can find this Jesus and but touch the fringe of his garment, I too will be clean and made whole. Sense the desperation. There is something that desperation brings out in us like nothing else. It forces us to consider, to move in ways that we haven't before. And that is where we find this woman. That desperate state leads her to action. And with her just thread of faith, she makes her way through the crowd. They are pressing against Jesus, but she finally pushes her hand through a seam in the crowd and grabs on, and for a fleeting moment just clutches the corner of his garment. Verse 27. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She came up behind him. What you need to note is that what this woman did was entirely against the law. It was. To pull her plan off, she had to break the Levitical law, and she did, went entirely against that Old Testament law stating you needed to stay separate. How do we reconcile that? She was desperate, and she needed grace, and that is what Jesus came to provide. The law was telling this woman, stay away, but grace was calling out, come closer. The law was saying, you're an outcast. Grace was extending an invitation. The law was saying, you're condemned. Grace was saying, healing is possible. Is the law bad? No, the law is good, but understand the primary purpose of the law is to show us how desperate we are. The purpose of the law is to drive us to grace. I need grace. I can't fulfill the law. So she comes up behind him in the crowd, touches his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Verse 29, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was free from her suffering. Jesus is pulled back by the grasp of her faith. Power has left him to surge through this hemorrhaging woman, and immediately she feels the rush of youthful health return. In the flood of those feelings, she releases her grasp and is swept away by the crowd. But Jesus doesn't let her get away. Although the crowd is pressing in on him, her touch was different. Verse 29. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" That's a good question today. Kind of a strange question. Even the disciples thought so. Verse 31. You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you ask, who touched me? Everyone, remember verse 24, was pressing in on Jesus. And so there obviously was something different about the touch of this woman in comparison to everyone else pressing in, crowding around him. What is that? Well, the crowd was there for the show. They wanted to see what would happen with Jairus' daughter. Miracle service, 7 p.m. Going to be a great show. Let's go. They were just onlookers. This woman wasn't interested in the show. She was there out of desperate need, longing for grace, longing just to touch Jesus. She wasn't going to be satisfied with being part of a parade. She wanted Jesus. And there is a spiritual parable here that you need to see. Because it is possible to be a part of the crowd around Jesus. It is possible to be part of a church gathering and never experience any intimacy with Jesus. You have to want Jesus. You have to reach out and try to grab a hold of Jesus. And so Jesus asked the question. Initially it appears like a strange question, but as we've seen throughout this series, he doesn't ask the question for his sake. He asked it for the woman's sake. He asked it for the crowd's sake. Verse 32. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. The whole truth, meaning she shared her story. Her entire story about being unclean. And when she said that, I bet there were people in the crowd who drew back. Unclean. So see, having this woman make her declaration in the midst of the crowd was important for her spiritual healing now, for her psychological healing. The question not only reestablished her in the community, but it spotlighted her as an example to the crowd. She moved. She acted in ways they hadn't. She had genuine faith, a small amount of faith, but she had genuine faith. She believed. She reached out. Jesus doesn't just heal her. He raises her up. Listen to his response. Verse 34. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Ostracized, penniless, a nameless outcast, a nobody, goes from that to daughter. Daughter. a nobody to being a daughter of Jesus. And remember how the story began. Verse 21, a man named Jairus comes and says, my daughter is about to die. And if you continue on in the chapter, Jairus' daughter is healed. But she's the second daughter healed. So the prominent, respectful man, no-name woman. Jesus brings healing to both families. The word healing, depending upon the context, it can be translated healed or saved. It comes from the Hebrew word yeshua, which is a variant of the Hebrew word Yeshua. And you know the name Yeshua, Jesus. This woman's desire for healing was ultimately her desire for Yeshua. All of our desires are ultimately a desire for Jesus. We just settle for far too little and much too less. Terrible English there, Mark. Much less than we should. When we read the passage and we go, okay, story from 2,000 years ago, don't have any circumstances that this woman had, certainly not as severe. But we all need desperately the grace of Jesus. So the application is simple. Come close, reach out. Don't be settled for anything else, but grab on to Jesus. Such a beautiful, tender picture of Jesus in that crowd, willing to stop for this one. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the beauty of your word, and I do pray that you would take it from 2,000 years ago and make it relevant right now to us, because we are this woman. Actually, maybe we're convicted that we're just a crowd. Just people going along in the noisy hustle and bustle and a little dab of Jesus. We're near Jesus. Create that hunger where we really earnestly seek him and reach out and ask for healing, deep healing in our life. Pray that in Jesus' name.